All right, everyone, we're gonna get started now. So yeah, once again, this is Palestine 101. We're gonna start by going over a very broad history of Palestine. And then we're gonna talk about how to talk about Palestine, and we're gonna bust some very common Zionist myths. I asked that everyone try to keep an open mind. And please don't be afraid to ask questions. We're gonna have time for a live Q&A at the end. But thank you so much for coming. Have a great night.
Hey comrades, I'm starting this off. My name's Andrew, you see him pronouns. Yeah, let's jump into it. So kind of going to move this presentation through chronologically. So we're going to start with some pre-1948, talk about the kind of origins of Zionism, and the historic Palestine, the context by which Zionism emerges and the Israeli state is ultimately founded. The key takeaway from this kind of first section is going to be that Zionism is a settler colonial project with roots that extend beyond 1948, and that since its inception, it has been built upon a foundation of white supremacy, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. We are going to take this both looking at Zionism as a political idea and its founding, as well as how it's manifested as a political movement and a political project with those who support it. So we first see early Zionism kind of emerging and taking hold throughout the later half of the 19th century and the early parts of the 20th century. As a modern form of nationalism for Jews, we do see this as kind of similar timing to which something like the Polish nationalist movements are emerging. And so we see these having kind of a shared context throughout much of Eastern and Central Europe. Theodor Herzl wrote Der Judenstaat, which is writings for the Jewish state in 1896, where he has outlined this plan of how the Jewish state would be founded. In this work, the Jewish state is not necessarily placed in Palestine. He says that Argentina and Palestine are the two best options, the two most realistic options. But ultimately kind of writes about Palestine and how we can create like the British India company, we create a Jewish company that can then, with wealthy Jews and wealthy Western supporters, fund Jewish settlement in Palestine. The first Zionist Congress is held in Basel in 1897. And this sought to build a legally secured home in Palestine for the Jewish people. The first kind of large and formal congress of the Zionist political movement in Europe. We also see kind of, again, at this end of the 1800s, early 1900s, Jewish aliyahs, which are kind of Jewish migrations to Palestine. Notably here, Jewish leaders long existed before the Zionist political project and before Zionist politics. There's a little known language called Palestinian Yiddish, which is kind of a mixture of Arabic and Yiddish, made by Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews who made aliyah to Palestine and lived there in peace with Palestinian neighbors, filled in a language that had words of both. And so we do see these aliyahs gaining a kind of political character within this project of Zionism and colonialism that was not existent before. We also see the establishment of the Jewish National Fund in 1901, which makes donations to create Jewish settlements, buy land in Palestine, and create Jewish farms and towns and camps there. The Jewish National Fund still does exist, sadly. Headquartered in Tel Aviv, but also with the headquarters in Denver. That's come under continuous protest for the last month and a half by our comrades there. And then we also see that early Zionism is emerging now as a national movement that had to dispossess, had to turn to colonial aspirations for its instantiation and its legitimacy. So we see in Herzl's writing clear thought about Zionism as a colonial project, and we see that for its legitimacy, it had to create these settlements, had to create and expel Palestinian people. So there is a picture of Jerusalem under Ottoman rule. And that's Palestinian women protesting British colonization. To talk about kind of Zionism and its relation to anti-Semitism here in this early stage. One thing to worth against is Lord Balfour was a foreign secretary of the British colonial government. Aliens Act of 1905, which restricted immigration of Eastern European and Russian Jews to England, banning that immigration, not allowing for that to occur. And we see theoretically Zionism for these Western colonial powers, for the English colonies, especially, is emerging as an answer to European leaders' racist problem with Jewish immigration and Jewish people. It's a reactionary response to anti-Semitism that provides safety for Jews without it being at the expense of those who perpetrated anti-Semitism, and safety for Jews that is also not particularly safe because it's on another people's stolen land. So it's not a particularly stable enterprise to build settlements on those stolen land, and it's not a particularly safe enterprise. It's really a way to move the Jews outside of Europe so that they can no longer be European leaders' political problems. So now to move to a really founding moment in Zionist history, the Balfour Declaration of 1917. People may, if anyone here has read Rashid Khalidi's 100 Years War on Palestine, but this is taken as a starting point in that book, and is a really important landmark moment. And it's a culmination of years of planning and lobbying by Zionists, by the Zionist movement as it existed to get it passed. And then this was British Foreign Minister Arthur Balfour's giving support for the founding of a Jewish national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. And it's a really central moment. There's a picture of the declaration there, which I'm not going to read in full, but I do want to really harp in on this term in the second paragraph. Where it says, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. And I think national home here is a really telling phrase, because it's not a Jewish state. It's not a national state, it's a national home. And this is particularly within this context of a British mandate. This national home is also a means for the British to assert control over Palestine, to concern an entry point into the Middle East, to watch maybe where oil is flowing in the Middle East, to really act as a center for colonization and for control of markets and of people in the Middle East. To colonization before World War II, or maybe in the interwar period, we see that Jewish immigration to Palestine and support for Zionism expands in the early 1930s amidst the risk of Nazism, more Jewish people moving to those settlements. We also see the transfer of state apparatus and means of production from British to Jewish immigrants. Perhaps one notable moment of this is in 1920, the Histadrut is founded, which is the general organization of Israeli workers. And it's played a pivotal role since its founding in 1920 to exclude Palestinians from the unions, to build settlements, to the apartheid wall in Israel is actually union made because it was built by Histadrut workers. So it's paid. This is kind of one of the apparatuses by which Jewish immigrants can, even workers, can control the means of production, control the Palestinian people, dispossess and assist in the dispossession and ethnic cleansing. We do see resistance to this by the Palestinian people, of course, beyond many riots and moments of resistance before 1936. We see the massive Great Palestinian Revolt through 1936 and 1939, which emerges in a series of peasant riots and a labor strike. And this is very continuous. There was a very violent Zionist response by the Haganah and Irgun, which are both kind of military, paramilitary troops, terrorist organizations of various sorts. Haganah, Irgun is a split from Haganah. It was a much more radical split. Haganah supposedly committed themselves to self-restraint, which Irgun refused to do. But neither were obviously very restrained. So that's the picture of the Palestinian general strike, the Arab revolt. So the white papers of 1939 and World War II. So the British government issued white papers in 1939 in response to a few things. One of them being the major Arab arrest that I've seen through this great Palestinian revolt. And in these white papers, it was not committed to a partition or to a Jewish state, but it did commit, it limited Jewish immigration and migration to Palestine. And it it limited Jewish immigration to Palestine and Jewish militias organized against British rule in that case. And Jewish immigration largely continued illegally off from that point. And so we do see this as a pivotal moment in which Jewish interests or the Zionist interests are perhaps now briefly in tension with the Western colonial power and British Empire. At the end of World War II, we see Holocaust refugees are denied entry to many of the Western states, England, and we see pressure mounts against Britain to allow Jewish refugees into Palestine, which is ultimately ceded to, and we see Holocaust refugees moving to Palestine after many years of struggle and endurance. And that's protest white papers. Yep. And then for the UN partition and end of British rule. So in 1947, we see the UN just proposed a plan for partition. I'm sure everyone's seen the map of this, with the North Coast, Galilee, and Negev go to Israel, and West Bank, Gaza, and Nazareth to Palestine, and trying to Jews are allocated 55% of the land. And this is notably Jews are allocated 55% of land, but they make nowhere near the majority of the population settled there. And then in May 15th, 1948, Britain cedes control of Palestine to Zionists, allowing for more and expansive Israeli expansion, even immediately. So kind of the second key takeaway going as we move forward is that the Israeli state was founded upon the Nakba, or the ethnic cleansing of 1948. The legacy of the Nakba is ever present and inextricable from the occupation. Nakba, for anyone who doesn't know, it means catastrophe. Founding of Israel, displacement, Nakba Day is on May 15th, and as is the supposed Israeli Independence Day. So again, just to go back to the context for a sec, we see under the British mandate and pre-supposed independence, 150,000 Palestinians are placed within and beyond the borders of Palestine, and we see citizenship denationalized for Palestinians, and so we see ongoing kind of slow expulsion. Throughout 1947 to 1949, this becomes far more rapid. Sorry, I have other stats on that. So we do see 750,000 are fled or expelled from their homes. 250 villages are destroyed. 15,000 Palestinians killed, over 70 massacred. And we see these paramilitary Zionist formations kind of forming the basis for the IDF and really pretty one-to-one getting merged into the IDF. To I think makes it tangible. Between December of 1947 and 1948, which is a 6-month period alone, only within that 6 months, we saw 440,000 Palestinians expelled and over 200 villages destroyed. And so we see really rapid violence and dispossession in a remarkably short period of time. And these were assisted by quite brutal violence in these various massacres. I'm not going to get into one too much. Oh, here's a map of the resolution, and I think we have physical maps there. People want to look afterwards, but it shows, I mean, a pretty immediate expansion of the Israeli state into the Palestinian partition territory. The Deir Yassin massacre was one of the largest and one of the most brutal massacres and of Zionist forces in this period. I think just to kind of display how violent this was, it is worth looking to see who the groups who perpetrated it was. Irgun was a major one, which was, of course, the split from the Haganah, which was a very violent Zionist military group without restraint. Also involved in the massacre was, oh no, sorry, I slipped my hand. Also involved were a group called the Stern Gang, is what they would formally know to. Lehi was would be the other the formal name, which was openly called themselves a terrorist organization, and quite proudly terrorized Palestinian people. So we do see this explicit and intentional violence and terrorism from the Zionist forces in these massacres during the Nakba. We have a film clip from a refugee from the Nakba, so I'll play that. Hopefully the audio works. Their control. Since the volume is up there, so we might not have time to do the clip, but we can maybe at the end come back and try and figure out the audio, and maybe send it around if anyone asks, then feel free to come up after. So these stories of violent massacres spread quite fast. We see systematic destruction of cities and the use of terror to encourage more Palestinian exodus and fleeing from their homes. And 8 of 13 operations are planned and executed outside the boundaries of the planned state. And then that's what panned out, which was a planned series of violence. I'm running a little behind, so I'm going to keep going. So you can see a map there of the Palestinian villages that were depopulated and razed, and there's also larger physical maps that we can check out afterwards. And as a result of the Nakba, we see a UN resolution 194, which is the right of return. This was passed in response to the 6.7 million refugees from 1948 Palestine, the mandate Palestine, who were expelled. And it was passed directly in response. It was passed in December of 1948. So it was directly in response to the Nakba. So most Palestinians displaced into Gaza and the West Bank. Current residents of Palestinian territories are still refused the right to return, as I'm sure everyone here is aware. And then the Palestinians left in 1948 territories became the lowest class of Israeli society, living under military rule, deeply restricted movement, unable to vote at the founding of the state, although that later changed. Yeah, you see pictures from the Nakba, see these internally displaced refugee camps. So moving to occupation. So we see between this period, after this period of 1940, in the immediate settlement of the Israeli state, military rule as kind of continued by the British. So there's curfews, there's restrictions of movement. We see Palestinians tried in military courts and detained for unlimited time without trial. This might sound familiar, as we still see administrative detention used against many Palestinians. I think 1 in 5 Palestinians are arrested in their lifetime, which is quite absurd. It's I think about 3 times higher than Black people in the United States, which is alone a pretty massive incarceration system, the largest in the world. I see separate unequal education systems. In 1966, there was a poll, and 85% of Palestinian youth failed to pass high school exams. We see more kind of continuous massacres, including the Rafah and Khan Yunis massacres. And so overall, we see in this kind of post-1948 governance of Palestinians, that Israeli law was ad hoc. It was made in response to Palestinians' actions to further criminalize, further dispossess, further oppress the Palestinian people. Al-Naqsa. So Al-Naqsa or the 1967 war is kind of the next major event to cover here. So in 1956, Israel invades Egypt to open the Straits of Tiran for Israeli shipping, during the Suez Crisis. And Nasser closed the Straits in May 1967, despite the Israeli assurances that this would be a cause for war. And they mobilized the Egyptian military along the border in preparation. Then in 1967, we saw a preemptive strike from Israeli forces against the Egyptian military, which triggered a conflict against all of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. And in this, we see the displacement of 150,000 more Palestinians. We also see massive displacement of Syrians from the Golan Heights. And we see the beginnings of the occupation of the Palestinian territories of the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights as we know it today. And I mean, and it's worth to address to editorials here. My family is from are Egyptian Jews who left Egypt in 1968, largely when the rest of Jews also left Egypt, partially in response to Israeli violence such as this. So we do see wide-ranging impacts and dispossession from Israeli affairs, although I don't mean to equate that with the Palestinian dispossession. And I'm going to pass it to Anuj here. Okay. Sorry, I mattered, but
Thank you everyone for coming again. And I forgot to introduce myself before. My name is Anuj, my pronouns are he, him. So again, thank you for coming. So I'm going to take us from the first Intifada to present day. The first Intifada took place from 1987 to 1993, a period of popular struggle. It consisted of civil disobedience, boycotts, and strikes against the Jewish settlements in the West Bank. Might, power, and beatings. This is a phrasing used by a member of the Israeli occupation forces for describing how they wanted to respond to the first Intifada. Because of that, 1,600 Palestinians were killed over that span of 6 years, and it resulted in the signing of the Oslo Accords. So these are some pictures of the first Intifada. So the Oslo Accords, signed in 1993 between the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Israeli government. It intended to create a 5-year pathway towards peace, and it divided the West Bank into 3 areas. But only one of those areas were to have full Palestinian sovereignty, which was only 18% of the West Bank. It also formed the Palestinian Authority, or the PA, which is essentially a puppet government of the Israeli occupation forces. The Oslo Accords also theoretically should have detailed the withdrawal of Israeli occupation forces from the West Bank to a certain extent. Most importantly, it left the issue of Jewish settlements, Jerusalem, and the right of return of Palestinians to their ancestral homes as final status issues, essentially saying that these were not issues that they could come to an agreement over when the Oslo Accords were signed. So this is a map of the West Bank. Area C, or the green area, is the only area that was supposed to have full Palestinian sovereignty under the Oslo Accords. Or sorry, Area A. So these are pictures of the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada, 7 years after the Oslo Accords, Israel has still not withdrawn their troops from the West Bank. The Oslo Accords, or the 5-year plan, the Oslo Plan, is declared a failure. The Oslo Accords at the time were already considered a capitulation by most Palestinians, and the Second Intifada was inevitable after the failure of Israeli occupation forces to even withdraw from the West Bank. This Intifada was far more violent than the first Intifada. It consisted of guerrilla warfare and disorganized violence, and as a result, 3,300 Palestinians were killed, and also 1,000 Israelis. It is used as a permanent justification of military occupation in Gaza, the open-air prison, and dehumanization of Palestinians. It also resulted in the Iron Dome, which the U.S. directly funds. Other results of the Second Intifada are removal of settlements in Gaza, and the start of the siege on Gaza, and it also legitimized the apartheid wall. So more pictures of the Second Intifada. It's a picture of a boy throwing a rock at a tank. So now let's talk about the apartheid wall, which essentially annexed 9.4% of the West Bank. The reason for this is the apartheid wall. Only 15% of the apartheid wall is built on the Israeli Green Line or within territories within the Israeli Green Line. The Israeli Green Line being the original 1967 borders. 85% of the apartheid wall or the West Bank wall or the so-called West Bank fence is built within the West Bank, which is why it de facto annexes 9.4% of the West Bank. Since the end of the Second Intifada, settlements have in the West Bank have continued to rise. They are regularly condemned by human rights organizations and the UN, but of course they are highly profitable to the state of Israel and further their goals of settler colonialism. Right now, there are over 8,000 political prisoners, or essentially hostages, in Israel that are taken from both the West Bank and Gaza. Let's talk about mobility and segregation. So the yellow roads are settler-only roads. Of course, most of them are within the Israeli Green Line. The red lines are roads that are restricted access to even Palestinians, and some of these roads are within the West Bank. There are military checkpoints throughout the West Bank and color-based IDs to dictate one's right to mobility. The white roads are the only ones that have full access to Palestinians, or that Palestinians have full access to. And this is the so-called West Bank fence, part of the Israeli apartheid wall. As you can see, it is not a fucking fence. And this is a map of Palestine over time. As you can see from the map from 1960 to 2017, Jewish settlements in the West Bank are continually increasing and suffocating connections between Palestinian-controlled areas. And this is the settler population in the West Bank over time. Is it okay if we take questions at the end? Is it pressing?
I'll just add something.
Of course.
You might just to add on, like it might seem kind of arbitrary the way that it looks split up, but part of it is like one fragmenting the Palestinian population by putting some people in the West Bank, some people in Gaza, and then Palestinian civilians within Israel are the one category, as well as Palestinians in diaspora. So there's like 4 separate categories of Palestinians, all with different experiences. That's one, and two, the way that Gaza and the West Bank is like, you know, was put on a map, though it's not really arbitrary. So if you look at a topological map, Gaza and the West Bank are like a little bit higher in their terrain than the surrounding Israeli area. And the reason for that is because that way when rain falls, Palestinians are really not allowed to collect rainwater because that water falls and then flows downhill into Israel. So that way they have more control over resources. They get the benefit of that water being there, which is part of why the logic behind preventing Palestinians from collecting their own water and being able to do this. That also harms agriculture is because you're not able to, you know, produce your own crops as well. And then that in a way also creates reliance on Israel for their economic output in terms of agriculture. So it also becomes a Palestinian economy because then their agriculture will be more expensive because it'll be more difficult to get water to grow food, etc. And so there's like a lot of ways in which this is like insidiously planned. It's not like that arbitrary. And there's more details on that, and that's what I know off the top of my head.
Thank you. And to add to even that, 97% of water within Gaza is undrinkable because of some of these policies, including purposely blocking off water supplies with concrete. So these are pictures of the West Bank and Jewish settlements within the West Bank. So one thing that settlers very often do is burn olive trees to aggress Palestinian farmers. Now, this is especially insidious because olives are 2 things to the Palestinians. One, it is a big portion of their economy, and 2, it is a symbol of resistance, which again makes the burning of olive trees by settlers particularly insidious. There's also the theft and destruction of water, farmland, and natural resources. The World Health Organization recommends access to 100 liters of water per person per day. Palestinians receive 70 liters, and settlers within the West Bank receive about 300 liters. Sorry. So now home demolitions with from 1967 to 2019, an estimated 49,532 Palestinian structures have been demolished by the Israeli occupation forces. There are segregated building codes and regulations, forcing people to build illegal structures and perpetuating the cycle of dispossession of Palestinians. Resistance to this by Palestinians is always met with violent repression, even if that resistance is peaceful. And audio still isn't working, so we're gonna skip this for now. Oh.
تحت الأرض زرعت زيتون، وهاي الأرض أخذتها من أهلي، بزرع شجرة الزيتون هي تعب عليها ونربيها ونخلصها، إيش يعني زي ولد، شايفة كيف لما بتربي ابنك، لما بتربي وتتعبي عليه وتربي وتيجي يعني لا سمح الله يصير في شيء، هذيك الساعة يعني الله يعني راح بتموت، يعني بتحسي روحك بهذا الخلق، يعني وأنا لما إجي فت على الأرض وشفتهم مطلعين، يعني حسيت روحي مش هتطلع. يعني حسيت روحي طلعت من يعني تتعبي وبتشتغلي زيت لما تيجي تلاقيها مصنع والله بتعز وبتعرفي عليها والله يعني الأرض كلها راحت، كل زيتون بلدنا راح، يعني قرنوط أكثر شيء تضررت، يعني أنا عندي خوف إني خايف منها الأرض تروح.
This is a picture of settler water supply and a demolished Palestinian home right in front of it. So now in the Gaza Strip, declared by the UN to be the largest open-air prison on the planet, and also it was declared inhabitable by 2020. 2007 was when the Israeli siege on Gaza started, a collective punishment for the election of Hamas. 1.9 million people live within 140 square miles. There's almost complete restriction of goods and movement. Unemployment at least 55%, and electricity for only 3 hours a day. Now a majority of the population in Gaza are also children. In 2014, 44% of all explosives used by Israel were used against Gaza in this 140 square mile space. Reports find that 23 to 70% of Palestinian children live with PTSD. The labeling of Hamas as a terrorist organization allows Israel to bomb public infrastructure for security, which is why we see them bomb hospitals, bomb schools, bomb refugee camps under the guise of fighting of anti-terrorism. This is a quick timeline on the Israeli aggressions on Gaza since the siege started. In 2008, a 22-day military offensive in which 1,400 Palestinians are killed, 80% of them civilians, 350 children. In 2012, 8 days of Israeli raids following Israel's killing of Hamas's Secretary Chief of Staff. 273 Palestinians were killed. Israel in 2014 massacres 2,200 Palestinians in Gaza, including 550 children. 18,000 homes were destroyed, and 6 Israeli civilians were killed. In 2018, the peaceful Great March of Return protests were met with violence from Israeli forces. At least 214 Palestinians were killed, and over 36,000, including nearly 9,000 children, are injured. Nearly 8,800 children are injured. 11 days of fighting in 2021 led to 260 Palestinians killed in Gaza and 13 people in Israel. In 2022, Israeli airstrikes resulted in the death of 49 Palestinians, including 17 children. And now in 2023, after Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, Israel has commenced a genocide in Gaza. At least 14,000 have been killed since. This is a picture of small fishing zones essentially allotted by Israel. It has led to overfishing and environmental destruction in the area. Okay. So that brings us to the present day. So let's talk about BDS and complicity within the United States. So the BDS movement has three demands: the end of colonization and occupation of all Palestinian land occupied in June 1967 and later on, a dismantling of the apartheid wall, and an end to the siege on Gaza, an end to apartheid, and legal recognition of Palestinians as citizens with equal rights within the Israeli Green Line, and the right of return for Palestinian refugees displaced by the occupation. BDS is a movement which is very, very important. The reason that we regard it as so important is because these are the same strategies that led to the end of apartheid in South Africa. It was collective boycott of South African goods, of companies that were supporting South African apartheid, that put financial pressure on institutions, that put political pressure on governments all over the world to sanction South Africa, and eventually led to the end of South African apartheid. So we use the BDS movement as a strategy. We use boycotts as a strategy to help achieve self-determination for Palestinians. So please, if you have time, look up the BDS National Committee, look up the boycott guidelines, and advocate as much as possible for BDS demands. So the last key takeaway: if we rethink Palestinian liberation into a framework of racial injustice, we come to recognize that Zionism, the Israeli state, and the notion of Jewish democracy are in themselves antithetical to justice and equality for Palestinians and Israelis. We can think of Palestine as an issue of racial justice. How can we tear down the structure of racial hierarchy in the Zionist state? Do we look for the one-state solution? Do we point to South Africa as an example? Ultimately, we should abide by the principle of self-determination and allow Palestinians to decide their own fate without seeking policy imperatives. This involves support for Palestinian resistance in any form it takes. Now I'm going to pass it over to Chris. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chris. So in this second part of the presentation, which should be a bit briefer, we're going to kind of zoom out from the historical details to address some especially prevalent myths, questions, and things like that that you probably all have been confronted with about Palestine. But maybe just before I do that, would it be helpful to give like a 90-second recap of like the big picture of the history, just so that we're all on the same page? Okay, so basically, big picture is the Zionist movement emerges in the 19th century. It has two main goals, basically. The first is to settle as many predominantly European, but possibly other Jews as possible in the land of Palestine. The second is to create a Jewish ethno-state in Palestine. And this is an important part of what Zionism is. It was never in its political program as it took shape, simply a project of getting Jews to immigrate out of Europe and into Palestine. It was a project of creating a Jewish-only state on Palestinian land that was already inhabited, that already had a history, that already had a people. And so this is why in 1948, when Zionist groups did conquer about 80% of Palestine by force, entailed in that conquering was also the mass expulsion of the Palestinians who lived there, because they were seen as effectively demographic pollutants to the ethnic purity of the Jewish state. From 1948, when 80% of Palestine was conquered, through to 1967, when the remaining 20% of Palestine was conquered, up until today, the Zionist movement, now realized in the state of Israel, has two goals: as much of Palestine as possible and as few Palestinians as possible. This has been the story of Zionism and its relation to the Palestinian people. I think that's the big picture. And then all these other things are the dynamics internal to, how does the Israeli state work to achieve those two goals in the West Bank, in Gaza? How do Palestinians resist this process of colonization in different regions in different decades? But that's the big picture story. So the first myth I want to address is the idea that Israel and Palestine are in conflict with each other. This terminology is almost hegemonic. I think it's losing some footing, but it's actually pretty sinister because the word conflict is very amorphous, it's very neutralizing, and it's very abstract. Generally speaking, when we talk about conflicts, we're talking about cases like maybe Russia and Ukraine. That is to say, we're talking about two parties that possess, once all international allies are taken into consideration, relatively equal power that are at war with each other. We don't generally use the word conflict to describe something like the native genocide that happened on Turtle Island. We don't generally use the word conflict to describe what happened to the indigenous people of Australia during British colonization. We don't use it to describe what the Nazis did to Jews, to Roma, to homosexuals. So it's a very loaded term, and we don't use it for Jim Crow. I mean, imagine calling Jim Crow the black-white conflict. It's kind of like that. On the one side, you have Israel, which is an expansionist colonizer and an ethno-state, which is ideologically opposed to the presence of all but one ethnicity in its borders. And it has the fourth largest military on earth. It has a massive nuclear arsenal, and it has the backing of virtually the entire political West. And Israel has always had Western imperial patrons. It's never acted alone. It's never operated alone. The West has always been invested in the Israeli project or the Zionist project as a means of basically creating an outpost for its own imperial interests in the Arab world. On the other side, you have the Palestinians, which are an indigenous people with no army, no state, no air force, and virtually no international allies. Iran is the only sort of exception, but it basically has nothing. So this is not a conflict in the usual or natural sense of the term. This is a case of settler colonialism being unfolded in real time and encountering resistance from an indigenous population that's struggling to remain on their land. And if you look at the map here, you can see the parallels between a case like North America, or the United States in this case, and a case like Palestine. This is not what the word conflict suggests, and it's a word that should not be used and should be resisted. Also, just like in quantitative terms, not that that's the primary point, but this is not a conflict either. And what we're currently seeing, even after October 7th, which was the most Israelis that have ever been killed in a single day, even since then, you're looking at roughly 15 to 20,000 Palestinians killed and roughly 850 Israeli civilians killed. There's no symmetry quantitatively, qualitatively. It's a colonial situation. It's not a conflict. It's also not complex. And I think this is actually probably the most sinister and effective bit of the propaganda because it preys on two very good instincts. It preys on a good epistemic instinct, which is to be humble, to not run your mouth about situations you don't understand. And it preys on a good moral instinct, to not do that in a situation where you know there are emotions flaring, where people might accuse you of anti-Semitism if you say the wrong thing, and you don't want to lapse into anti-Semitism or something. And so you say, okay, I guess I just don't know. And it has a silencing effect. But there is nothing complex about this situation. I mean, I guess I can editorialize too and say that when I first started seriously studying this maybe 6 years ago, I was actually genuinely confused because I kept waiting for when it was going to become complex. Honestly, I was just puzzled for months. I was puzzled. But there's nothing there. I mean, like the emperor has no clothes in this case. What Israel is doing is a very familiar thing. It's not unique to Israel. Israel isn't the first to do it, though it is one of the only countries currently engaged in the same kind of process. But it looks a lot like what Australia and the United States have done and continue to do to indigenous peoples. It looks a lot in terms of maintaining sort of ethno-nationalist purity, like what Turkey does to Kurds, to Armenians. And the Palestinian resistance closely parallels what all colonized peoples have done under similar circumstances, whether that's the indigenous people here, whether that's the Algerians under France, or the Vietnamese under France and the US. There's nothing complex about the situation unless you think that Palestinians are somehow less valuable than Israeli Jews, such that you have to make a sort of balancing act of like, okay, well, it's not complicated if all the people are equal, but it becomes complicated, you know, if one side is less deserving of self-determination, less deserving of dignity than the other. The third myth is that Israel is somehow singled out in an unfair way for criticism, usually with the insinuation that this is happening for anti-Semitic reasons. The reality is much closer to the opposite. It's true that you have stacks of UN resolutions condemning Israeli behavior passed by the General Assembly, but the General Assembly has no enforceable power. which is why the resolutions keep getting passed there, because the Security Council is the organ of the UN that does have enforceable power, and it also has the US as a permanent member, which means every time there is a resolution against Israel for any of these crimes, the US vetoes it as a matter of policy, and it's sometimes other states too, sometimes Britain, sometimes France. This means that Israel never actually faces accountability for anything. The UN might talk about Israel a lot, but they're talking about it a lot because nothing is changing. Compare, for example, the now 56-year-long Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and the international response to it with Saddam Hussein's occupation of Kuwait. In the Kuwait case, basically within a year, you had an international war coalition going in to intervene. You had sanctions imposed by huge portions of the global community on Saddam, and you had an end to the occupation very quickly. The Israeli case, you have 56 years, no accountability, no repercussions, virtually no sanctions. And the reason for that is because the US and other Western powers are committed to their role as maintaining, as basically Israel's imperial sponsors. Nothing happens, and there's a special responsibility to single out Israel, so to speak, if you're in the US for precisely this reason. Not because Israel is the only state in the world, but the only evil state in the world, but because it is an evil state whose evil is directly enabled, aided, and abetted by our government, our tax dollars, and our academic institutions. So there's a special accountability that we have to Palestinians that we don't have to, say, people marginalized in China. There's a different level of responsibility there. Another myth is that Israel is sometimes, let's say, a flawed democracy, or the only democracy in the Middle East, whatever. It's not by any stretch of the term a democracy. There's about 14 million people that live under Israeli rule. About 7 million of them, about half of them are Jews, and about half of them are non-Jewish Arabs, mostly Palestinians. 5 million of the Palestinians living under Israeli rule live under a military dictatorship. This is the population in the West Bank and Gaza. They have no political rights, no self-determination, no freedom of movement, no freedom of education, nothing. It's a dictatorship, full stop. The other 1.6 million or so Palestinians who managed to remain inside what became legally defined Israel after 1948 are at best third-class citizens. There's more than 60 laws on the book that discriminate against them, that curtail, especially like more than 90% of the land in Israel is off limits for purchase by Palestinian citizens of Israel. In the south of Israel, in the Negev Desert or Nakab Desert, there are huge Palestinian communities that have had a presence there for centuries in some cases. Their homes are routinely demolished. They're declared basically illegal immigrants. And these are the people that are Israel's citizens. Like these are the Palestinians that have it best. So this is not a democratic situation any more than Jim Crow was or apartheid South Africa was. It's a democracy for Jews, and it's either a dictatorship or a brutal apartheid regime for everybody else. Another myth is that the two-state solution, so-called, is the only way forward. There's three pretty fundamental problems with insisting on this, at least. The first is that, historically speaking, I could get into the details, but I don't want to waste time. Israel will never accept this. The last two prime ministers are explicit about this. Previous ones said it will never happen in private, pretended to support it in public, but it's a political non-starter. And in fact, using it as a sort of smokescreen has been the US and Israeli tactic for a long time. You always just pay lip service to the idea of a two-state solution as Israel continues stealing every inch of the fragment of historic Palestine, where theoretically, hypothetically, maybe someday there will be a Palestinian mini-state established. So it's not just politically unviable, it's also sinister in the way that it's invoked, because it allows the colonization to continue expanding, while creating some image of like caring about Palestinians and wanting self-determination for them on the, say, US government side. It also does nothing to address, okay, so again, in 1948, Israel conquered about 80% of historic Palestine. The two-state solution proposes keeping Israel as a Zionist state, which is to say a Jewish ethno-state, on 80% of historic Palestine and giving Palestinians some of the remaining 20%. This does nothing to address the plight of the more than 6 million Palestinian refugees, the descendants of the people expelled in 1948 from that 80%, who have been denied their legal and moral right to return to lands now inside Israel. And in a two-state paradigm inside Israel, this says nothing about them. Basically, they're still just fucked. They're in like unlivable camps in Lebanon indefinitely. but they should take some consolation in the fact that some Palestinians managed to have semi-sovereignty in a tiny fraction of the land that they're not even from. It also doesn't address the plight of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, who I just mentioned, who still live under apartheid because they're still living in a Jewish ethno-state. And plus, like the Palestinian birth rate among citizens of Israel is significantly higher than the Jewish birth rate inside Israel, which is a source of continual anxiety for the Israeli government, because this population of their citizens is described as a demographic threat. And so if your fundamental commitment is to maintaining a Jewish ethno-state alongside, I guess, a Palestinian ethno-state, the question you need to answer and confront people with is, currently, there's about 25% of Israeli citizens who are non-Jews. What if it reaches 35%? What if it reaches 45%? At what point, if your fundamental commitment is to maintaining the ethnic purity of the Jewish state, are you going to just support another wave of ethnic cleansing? And if you would support that at some theoretical point, why don't you just be honest and say you support it now, rather than paying lip service to the two-state idea that sounds nice, but doesn't address the dynamics? The fundamental problem is and has always been the ideology of Zionism, which is its core tenet is the claim that Jews and only Jews possess the right of self-determination throughout the land of Palestine. If that's not gotten rid of, two states or otherwise, there won't be peace, there won't be justice, there won't be anything. Bringing it to a more contemporary context, it is not true. Legally, it's not true. Historically, it's not true. Factually, it's not true that Hamas started a war on October 7th. Israel has been in a state of war against Palestine and against the Palestinian people since 1948, and especially in the case of Gaza since 1967, when it imposed a military occupation illegally on all the people in that land. And since 1967, it has slowly but surely turned Gaza into what even the late Israeli sociologist Baruch Himmerling called the world's largest concentration camp ever. This is not hyperbole, and concentration camp is not the same as extermination camp, though Gaza is fast being turned into that now. But it is a place where Palestinians, since 2006, have been completely isolated. People die every week because they're not even allowed to go get medical treatment. Israel controls the number of calories at certain points in its history that it allows into Gaza to keep people in a hungry state without dying of starvation. This has been the situation that Israel has imposed on Gaza. So what happened on October 7th was a revolt from people that had lived for decades in a concentration camp. It was a grisly episode. Atrocities were committed. That doesn't mean that they started the war, though. The war, this was an episode in an ongoing war of the Zionist project against the Palestinian people, in which the state of Israel and the Zionist movement has always been the primary aggressor and has always been the holder of power in terms of resolving the situation. The power is all on Israel's side. The Palestinians have nothing. So it's very important to emphasize that even when violence is horrific, that doesn't make it initiatory. That doesn't make Palestinians aggressors. The aggressor in the situation is and can always only be the one who's militarily occupying another people, the one who's dispossessing and systematically ethnically cleansing another people. Resistance is not the same thing as aggression. And finally, on a similar note, I've seen signs on campus from the Maroons for Israel crowd and others making this claim about the current genocide, which is that it's not genocide because it's self-defense. Couple problems with this. First, legally speaking, I don't want to get lost in the technicalities here, but Israel, as a military occupier under the Geneva Conventions, cannot possibly be in a position of self-defense relative to a territory that it occupies. It may have interest in defending certain citizens from certain individuals, but it can no more be in a position of self-defense than, for example, the US state can be in a position of self-defense relative to a domestic terrorist or something. So it's a categorical confusion. But secondly, and more importantly, virtually no Israeli civilians have been killed in the last 5, now 6 weeks. So October 7th is over. There is no Hamas operating inside the Israeli border. There are no Israeli civilians being killed. All that we're seeing now is a clear campaign of genocidal retribution, which is explicitly aimed not at protecting, and when I say explicitly, I mean according to quotes by Israeli ministers, Israeli prime minister, a defense minister, president, and so forth. The aim of this is to basically make the whole of Gaza unlivable, to solve the Gaza question once and for all, by either exterminating or expelling as many people as possible from that area, from this tiny corner of land, just getting rid of it forever. It's revenge, it's slaughter, it's not self-defense. It doesn't matter what happened on October 7th. no one is dying in Israel now. This is just revenge. And finally, it's a sort of silly argument to me that self-defense is not genocide, because some of the worst genocides in history have been perpetrated precisely in the name of self-defense. There's almost always some pretext. The Italian genocide in Libya, the Turkish genocide of Armenians were justified by saying, oh, these separatist radical terrorists have attacked our civilians, therefore we have no choice but to send 1 million Armenians on a death march into the desert. Sounds a lot like Israel saying, these brutal Hamas terrorists attacked our civilians, we have no choice but to send them on a brutal death march into the Egyptian Sinai. So it's a lazy argument. Oh, and I did want to, do I have time to read this quote?
Yeah.
Okay, it's a great quote from Reed Barghouti, who's a late Palestinian poet. He died a couple of years ago. But I think it gets to the point at hand, which is it's easy to blur the truth with a simple linguistic trick. Start your story from secondly. Yes, this is what he's talking about an Israeli Prime Minister Rabin did. He simply neglected to speak of what happened first. Start your story with secondly, and the world will be turned upside down. Start it with secondly, and the arrows of the Red Indians are the original criminals, and the guns of the white man are entirely the victims. It's enough to start with secondly for the anger of the black man against the white to be barbarous. Start with secondly, and Gandhi becomes responsible for the tragedies of the British. There's some quotes, but I already kind of alluded to them. So.
Hi, my name's Mike. We're talking about the last few common myths. One common question that's asked is, where's the Palestinian Mandela? Or where is the Palestinian Gandhi? Meaning, why can't Palestinians just employ some kind of nonviolent resistance, and then that will be the best and most effective way for them to gain their freedom? So first I want to play a clip from Nelson Mandela pretty quick, where he's giving a speech in Gaza in 1999.
Choose peace rather than confrontation, except in cases where we cannot judge, where we cannot proceed, where we cannot move forward. Then, if the only alternative is violence, we will use violence.
So Nelson Mandela is making his position clear that he's not purely a pacifist, that he is prefers nonviolent methods of resistance, but if there's no other way forward, then violence can be justified. Okay, and then we have a quote from Gandhi from 1946 after some riots in Bengal, where he says, "It is sad that people should have left their homes and flocked to towns for relief. You must stick to your villages in face of any aggression and violence. Fight violence with nonviolence if you can, and if you can't do that, fight violence by any means, even if it means your utter extinction. But in no case should you leave your hearths and homes to be looted and burnt." So a similar position around nonviolence and use of force by Gandhi. And so it shouldn't be any surprise that both Nelson Mandela and Gandhi have expressed support for the Palestinian cause. Mandela having his famous quote in 1997 that "We know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians." And Gandhi back in 1938, when he was asked questions about Palestine, said that Palestine belongs to the Arabs in the same sense that England belongs to the English or France belongs to the French. The nobler course would be to insist on a just treatment of the Jews wherever they are born and bred. Jews born in France are French in precisely the same way that Christians born in France are French. So Gandhi similarly advocating for equal treatment of all people and for support of the rights of the native Palestinians rather than the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. And so now that we know that Gandhi and Mandela supported nonviolence until nonviolence was not possible and then violence could be justified, it's worth discussing some of the nonviolent methods that have been advocated for by the Palestinians. Of course, we mentioned boycott, divestment, and sanctions, the movement earlier in the presentation. And Omar Barghouti, the founder of BDS, was awarded the Gandhi Peace Award at Princeton University several years back. So what has the response been here in the United States, which of course is the largest international supporter of Israel? Well, the US responded by proceeding to ban boycotts of Israel. And as you can see here in this map compiled by Palestine Legal, there are currently 38 states in the US that have legislation either restricting or banning boycotts against the state of Israel. Famous example is in Texas, a speech pathologist in a public school was fired from the public school because she supported the BDS movement. Journalist Abby Martin in Georgia was not allowed to speak on a state campus, a college campus in Georgia, because she didn't sign a pledge saying that she doesn't support BDS, so she wasn't allowed to speak on campus. So the response has been repression of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement here in the United States, even though boycotts are, of course, protected under the First Amendment and have a long tradition here in the United States. And then we talked briefly about the Great March of Return earlier in the presentation, but just to remind people, the Great March of Return, which took place over many weeks in 2018, was a nonviolent series of protests in Gaza, where Gazans would march up to the fence of Gaza in order to demand their liberation. And so we have a brief clip of the organizer of these protests talking about them.
تناضل في سبيل الحرية إنسانية المنقوص. كانت في 7 ديسمبر 2017. ففي تلك الليلة سجلت خاطرة على الفيسبوك بأنه يعني حتى الطيور والحيوانات أكثر تصالحا مع الطبيعة من البشر، يعني لماذا البشر يقيموا هذه الأسلحة وهذه الأسلاك الشائكة بينهم؟ بعد حوالي شهر كتبت خاطرة أخرى كانت كالتالي: ماذا لو أن 100,000 أو 200,000 من اللاجئين الفلسطينيين في قطاع غزة قرروا بلحظة واحدة أن يزحفوا بطريقة سلمية نحو السلك العازل ويقطعوا هذا السلك العازل ويقولوا نحن نريد أن نعود إلى ديارنا ونريد الحياة ولا نريد أكثر من الحياة. ختمت هذا البوست بهاشتاج اقترح خيالي هو مسيرة العودة الكبرى. الفلسطينيون في حالة سجن حقيقي يتعرضون للحصار للموت البطيء، إذا لماذا لا نطلق جدران السجن؟ شهر واحد فقط من هذا المشروع تحولت إلى تيار عام في المجتمع. 15 هو يوم يفترض أن يكون يوم الثروة ولكنه ليس يوم النهاية. لماذا؟ لأننا نحن شعب نناضل في سبيل الحرية وفي سبيل الكرامة وفي سبيل تقدير المصير، فمبادرة انتهاء مسيرة العودة وتحقيق أهدافنا. هل ستتحقق بعد يوم، بعد شهر، بعد سنة، بعد 10 سنوات؟ دولة الاحتلال هذه عبء ليس على غزة وحدها ولا على الضفة وحدها ولا على الفلسطينيين داخل وحدهم، هي عبء على العالم. إذا لن تكون إنسانا إلا حين تناضل في سبيل الحرية، إن لم تناضل في سبيل الحرية إنسانيتك منقوصة.
Okay, so then following the Great March of Return, what was the state of Israel's response to it? Well, it was overwhelming force and violent suppression. So there was a report by the United Nations. You can see an excerpt from here that found that the Israeli security forces killed 183 protesters with live ammunition, and that they shot with live ammunition an additional 6,106 Palestinians. And then there were another over 3,000 Palestinians injured with rubber bullets or tear gas canisters or bullet fragmentation. Okay, so the next myth that's commonly used to justify the mass killing of civilians in Gaza by Israel is that Hamas uses human shields, meaning that Hamas intentionally puts Gazan civilians in harm's way in order to try and get them killed and increase the civilian death toll, essentially trying to prevent them from leaving and putting them in harm's way. And so if you want to find out whether or not this type of a claim is true, you don't ask the Israeli government, you don't ask Hamas, you need to look to independent investigations that have seriously inquired. And so Amnesty International, which is the second largest human rights organization in the world, did an investigation in 2009 after Operation Cast Lead, which was 2008 to 2009. And they found that contrary to repeated allegations by Israeli officials of the use of human shields, Amnesty found no evidence that Hamas or other Palestinian fighters directed the movement of civilians to shield military objectives from attacks. It found no evidence that Hamas or other armed groups forced residents to stay in or around buildings used by fighters, nor that fighters prevented residents from leaving buildings or areas which had been commandeered by militants. Amnesty investigated the same question in 2014 after Israel's major assault on Gaza, Operation Protective Edge, and they found the same thing. Amnesty is monitoring and investigating such reports, but does not have evidence at this point that Palestinian civilians have been intentionally used by Hamas or Palestinian armed groups during the current hostilities to shield specific locations or military personnel or equipment from Israeli attacks. However, there is evidence of Palestinians being used by human shields by human rights organizations, or that human rights organizations found, and all of the evidence has been found that Israel has used Palestinians as human shields. So this is from a report from B'Tselem, which is the largest human rights organization in Israel. It's an Israeli-run human rights organization. It says since the beginning of the occupation in 1967, Israeli security forces have repeatedly used Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza as human shields, ordering them to perform military tasks that risk their lives. As a part of this policy, soldiers have ordered Palestinian civilians to remove suspicious objects from roads, to tell people to come out of their homes so military can arrest them, to stand in front of soldiers while the latter shoot from behind them, and more. Palestinian civilians were chosen at random for these tasks and could not refuse to the demand placed on them by armed soldiers. The use of civilians is not an independent initiative by soldiers in the field, but the result of a decision made by senior military authorities. During the Second Intifada, and particularly during the military incursions into Palestinian population centers, such as Operation Defensive Shield in April 2002, use of Palestinian human shields became an open military policy. And similar reports from Human Rights Watch, which is the largest human rights organization in the world. Human Rights Watch in 2002, in a report, found that the IDF routinely coerced civilians to perform life-endangering acts that assisted IDF military operations. Eyewitnesses and victims described to Human Rights Watch how friends, neighbors, and relatives of wanted Palestinians were taken at gunpoint to knock on doors, open strange packages, and search houses in which the IDF suspected armed Palestinians were present. Some families found their houses taken over and used as military positions by the IDF during an operation, while they themselves were ordered to remain inside. In one case documented by Human Rights Watch, a civilian was held hostage in order to pressure his brother to surrender. And in yet another report, they found that in its May 2002 report, Jenin IDF military operations, Human Rights Watch documented several cases of IDF use of human shields, including one case in which 8 Palestinian men, including a 14-year-old boy, were taken from their homes and placed on a balcony overlooking Palestinian fighter positions while IDF soldiers fired from behind the men. In another case, IDF soldiers put a 65-year-old Palestinian woman on the exposed roof of her home during a gun battle. So the line that we most commonly hear used by Israeli officials in the media, that the high civilian death toll is all the fault of Hamas for using human shields. All of the major human rights organizations have found evidence that Israel, not Hamas, is guilty of using Palestinian civilians as human shields. And so the last myth, I believe, that we're going to discuss is one that says, from the river to the sea is a call for genocide, or often people say, from the river to the sea means people want to push all of the Jews into the sea. So just as a basic reminder, from the river to the sea is just literally a geographic description of the region of historic Palestine between the Jordan River here on the right side of the picture and the Mediterranean Sea here on the left. And so when Palestinians call for freedom from the river to the sea, it means they don't just want freedom within the West Bank and in Gaza, but in the entirety of their ancestral homelands, all of what's known as Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. And so the phrase itself originated back in the 1960s and was associated with the PLO, in order to call for Palestinian liberation and a democratic state for everyone in all of Palestine. And in 1964, the original charter of the PLO, of the Palestine National Charter, here's a quote from it. It says that Jews of Palestinian origin are considered Palestinians if they're willing to live peacefully and loyally in Palestine. So very clearly in contradiction with the claim that Palestinians want all of the Jews to be thrown into the sea. In 1968, they reiterate that the Jews who had normally resided in Palestine until the beginning of the Zionist invasion will be considered Palestinians. And in 1969, the Fatah Party said that we are fighting today to create the new Palestine of tomorrow, a progressive, democratic, and non-sectarian Palestine in which Christian, Muslim, and Jew will worship, work, live peacefully, and enjoy equal rights. So the phrase "from the river to the sea" originated in conjunction with a movement for a secular state with the PLO, and in fact calls for one equal state for all of the residents, actually goes back even to the British Mandate period, and was proposed by Palestinian leadership in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s, and was always rejected by the Zionists. But "from the river to the sea" is specifically associated with originally the PLO and their movement in the 1960s. And so the phrase has actually been used by lots of different groups, not just Palestinians. Here we have a quote from the original charter of the Likud party in 1977, which is the party of which Benjamin Netanyahu is a member. And it says, "The right of the Jewish people to the land of Israel is eternal and indisputable and is linked with the right to security and peace. Therefore, Judea and Samaria will not be handed to any foreign administration. Between the sea and the Jordan, there will only be Israeli sovereignty." So they're using a phrase, but they're using it to mean something different, meaning only a Jewish ethno-state, a state of Jewish domination and supremacy in the entirety of historic Palestine. We see something similar recently in 2017. This is a quote from an article that Bezalel Smotrich wrote. He's currently the finance minister of Israel, and he's someone who has openly described himself as a fascist. He said, "We will make it clear that our national ambition for a Jewish state from the river to the sea is an accomplished fact, a fact not open to discussions or negotiation." So it's not whether or not "from the river to the sea" is a problematic phrase because it's just a geographic description, but you have to then just read a couple of extra words or sentences and to see what they're calling for between the river and the sea. And so in the current charter of Hamas, which was most recently written in 2017, they say Hamas rejects any alternative to the full and complete liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea. And in case it's unclear on what exactly they're calling for, they clarify in the very same document. Hamas affirms that its conflict is with the Zionist project, not with the Jews because of their religion. Hamas does not wage a struggle against Jews because they are Jewish, but wages a struggle against the Zionists who occupy Palestine. Yet it is the Zionists who constantly identify Judaism and the Jews with their own colonial project and illegal entity.
I'm sorry that we're almost at 8 p.m. We can definitely stay for questions. I just wanted to conclude with 5 kind of practical takeaways in terms of the language that you use in conversations and stuff on behalf of SJP. Like especially important things to keep in mind as you speak about Palestine, as you have conversations with people, friends, family, whatever. When you talk about Israel-Palestine, and I think most of this should be clear, meaning the reasons behind it should be clear by now. The language of colonialism is correct. It's the most accurate, it's the most precise, and it's the most comprehensive. Not the language of complex conflict, interreligious conflict, anything like that. It's a case of a settler colonial project being imposed on an indigenous population, and it should be described in those terms. Occupation and apartheid are important categories, but they take place within the wider frame of colonial expansionism. The West Bank and Gaza are occupied not because Israel just decided to be mean one day and occupy these areas, but because they are integral to what has always been the Israeli project of colonizing all of Palestine. And if you can't fully colonize them yet, you occupy them and then incrementally colonize them step by step. Same thing for apartheid. Ideally, all the Palestinians are gotten rid of, but if they're not gotten rid of, at least you confine them to unlivable ghettos, and hopefully they'll give up and leave someday. Second, talking about Zionism is really important, and not confusing Zionism in any way, shape, or form with Jews, Jewishness, Judaism, whatever. Most Zionists in the world are not Jews, and many Jews are not Zionists. This is really fundamental. Zionism is a political project. It's a colonial endeavor to create a exclusivist ethno-state on historic Palestine and expel all of the people you can who don't belong to that ethnicity in the process. So framing things in terms of Zionism, even more than talking about like Israelis or the Israeli government, is really important, because the Israeli government and the Israeli state are just outworkings of this Zionist ideology, and they have remained faithful to it, lock, step, and barrel from the beginning. It's not fundamentally a problem about Israelis being bad people, though many of them are. The problem is fundamentally about the ideological project in which all of the Jewish Israelis are embedded. Some of them, they're a vanishingly small minority at this point, but there are some Israeli anti-Zionists. So again, Zionism is the main thing, not Jew, not Israeli, not whatever else. Another thing is using the language of indigenous or anti-colonial resistance to describe armed struggle in Palestine rather than the language of Islamic terrorism is very important. First, because terrorism does not really have a coherent or stable definition. It's basically a political bludgeon that's thrown around at whichever weaker group the West currently dislikes. It doesn't map on in any way with the compliance or non-compliance that those groups possess when it comes to human rights. It's an ad hoc thing, it's selectively deployed, and more, I think, damagingly, it completely erases history when you call a group terrorists. So what you're doing when you call a group terrorist is you're suggesting that these people are committing not just terrible crimes, but they're committing them for basically inexplicable reasons, simply because they're savages, because they're Muslims, because they're Arabs, because they're whatever. And just like that, when you say terrorism about Palestinian resistance, even if you're talking about Palestinian war crimes, terrorism does not clarify anything about war crimes that Palestinians commit. All it does is it erases the entire historical backdrop in which this violence is taking place, in a way that completely distracts from the root causes of violence in this whole situation, which are basically root causes embedded in the project of Zionism. And like every other colonial endeavor, Zionism has provoked resistance, some violent, some non-violent, some legitimate, some very ugly. But there's nothing unique about the situation, and the language of terrorism just obscures that. So framing things in terms of resistance keeps the emphasis on where the violence started, where the aggression started. And it didn't start with Palestinians. It certainly didn't start with Hamas, which didn't even exist, for the first 40 years of Israel's colonial enterprise. Finally, speaking in terms of Palestinian liberation and decolonization, not in terms of dialogue, negotiations, two states, whatever. I don't know who would still say it would be good to call for, a black-white dialogue to address Jim Crow, or to have a negotiation, basically, about how much basic human dignity the white American population is willing to grant the black population. The black population is supposed to go along with this and be very civil and be very respectable and say, okay, well, I'll accept 30%, it's better than the 20% you offered last time. What is needed is a dismantling of Zionism, which means a dismantling of the Israeli state as it has always existed, which is as an embodiment of Zionism, and its replacement with some kind of just social order in which people, like Mike was talking about, do not have to fear that their house is going to be demolished, that their community is going to be ethnically cleansed, that they're going to be driven off their land, that they're going to be placed under military occupation on account of being the wrong religion or the wrong ethnicity. And that's what from the river to the sea means. It means no more ethno-states, no more apartheid, no more ethnic cleansing, no more genocide anywhere for anyone between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. Oh, finally, sorry, there's a fifth thing. Always use maps. Edward Said remarked one time that you will never see maps as a rule in US or Zionist Israeli media. And the reason for that is that a lot of the myths that we've talked about today fall apart very quickly as soon as you're actually looking at a picture of what's going on. This is not a conflict. This is not complicated. This is not terrorists against which Israel is defending itself. And this is not interreligious. It's about land. And it's about power over land and about settling land and displacing indigenous inhabitants. So always use maps. It's super important. And it shuts down a lot of these myths before they can even get going. Okay, question. Do you want to?
Any and all questions are welcome, but thank you all for staying so long. If you want to grab any food, that's more than welcome. When we have the space till 8:30.
After October 7th, I noticed a lot of people like responding to calls in Palestine by basically just being like Hamas is bad, or also notably like talking about how Hamas is explicitly anti-Semitic, which feels like a distraction from like the actual importance. But I'm wondering if you have suggestions for like language or strategies to like redirect from people being like, well, I can't say that because Hamas is anti-Semitic, or by like responding in multiple times, by just like showing like anti-Semitic things Hamas is anti-Semitic.
I mean, I guess I'd say two things. One is that I think it's very important when communicating with people about Palestine to not let your position have the appearance of rising or falling based on whether Hamas does good things, bad things, whatever. I mean, it's not about Hamas, and it has never been about Hamas. The fact that this latest surprise attack on October 7th was led by Hamas, that wasn't even exclusively Hamas. It was also Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It was also the secular PFLP. They're the ones that led this operation, not because they're Islamists or something, because they're the only resistance group in Gaza that has any basically ammunition. If Hamas didn't exist, I can almost guarantee you some other armed faction would exist in its place. Other armed factions existed before it, have arisen since then in the West Bank. So I would just decenter Hamas from the conversation. The point is not, and I mean, Hamas is a very ugly group in a lot of ways. I mean, I don't know anyone in all Palestine organizing who has a favorable impression of Hamas. But the question is why this is being exceptionalized as a thing to talk about. And so even then, I think it's useful to talk more in terms of Palestinian resistance as a whole. That includes BDS, that includes all the different armed factions, that includes grassroots struggle, civil uprisings in various West Bank towns and stuff. But speak in broad terms about Palestinian resistance, and don't get lost in the weeds about either exceptionalizing acts of violence that are genuinely terrible that Hamas committed, or insisting that they didn't commit atrocious acts, especially if you don't know. I mean, like, it's just a kind of losing strategy, because Hamas is not the point. Zionism and Palestinian resistance is the point.
I'd also like to add to that, to use history to your advantage. As I said, there are armed factions before Hamas. Hamas was created in 1987. It's relatively new in the settler colonial campaign. And also since 1987, since Hamas's creation, Israel has had a strategic plan to prop up Hamas above the secular struggles in the region. So we should always ask, why is that? Why does Israel want to prop up Hamas? And it's because they want to use it as an excuse. They want to use Hamas as an excuse to bomb hospitals, to bomb schools, to bomb refugee camps. Because ultimately, their goal isn't to wipe out Hamas. If their goal was to wipe out Hamas, they would have never funded Hamas.
To add on to that, what you're saying, like that's also a really useful talking point when countering the idea that like Israel is a necessity to protect Jews both in Israel and in the Jewish diaspora around the world. That's a really good counterpoint for that. And additionally, the Israel's bombing of Iraqi Jewish houses and communities is, which I don't have a source for off the top of my head, but I can even just Google that, it'll show up.
Yeah. Also the sterilization of the sterilization of Ethiopian Jews that immigrated to Israel.
Yeah. I wanted to both offer something and ask for more resources, but I think that one thing that I read that made me feel a lot more grounded in the facts of it all is Palestine: A Socialist Introduction. I really enjoyed that book because it really lays it out in clear terms what happened in the Nakba, why we're even fighting for all of this. And so I would recommend that book, and also wanted to know if you guys have any other resources that you would recommend.
Sure. So for like a broader analysis of like the leading up to the Nakba, I'd recommend The Revolution of 1936 to 1939 by Ghassan Kanafani. I'd also recommend Palestine, Israel, and the U.S. Empire by Richard Becker. But do you have any more recommendations?
For general overviews of the history, or for stuff about Gaza, or for
all of the
all of the above? I mean, Rashid Khalidi's book, The 100 Years War in Palestine, is very good as a general primer that kind of covers the whole history. I think Norman Finkelstein's book, Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom, is really good if you want to understand the details of what life has been like for decades in the Gaza concentration camp. Those are two that come to mind off the top of my head.
And by the way, I have copies to almost like all of these books like on me right now. If anyone wants to take a look at the back of them, and just like read a little bit of them and see if you're interested in reading more. Like I have a copy right now on me.
I'm sorry, actually one more that just popped into my head is Ali Abu Nima's book, One Country, is very good if you are trying to think past a two-state solution into what would liberation actually look like. It's basically a defense for a certain kind of single democratic state in which Jews, Muslims, Christians, etc., are fully equal, and it addresses a lot of objections to that idea very effectively.
And also decolonizepalestine.org is a good resource that addresses a lot of common myths and like lays out all of the evidence explicitly refuting the most prevalent Zionist claims. And also, if you want any of those books, we have PDFs that we can send if that's your preferred method of reading.
Do you want me to add to that or another?
Yeah, I was gonna add to that. I wanted to make a really big recommendation to the Jadaliya teaching series, which is on the website Palestine in Context, which since October 7th, they've been doing weekly teaching on everything from the social history of Gaza from before 1948 until today. Geographically, why does Gaza have the borders that it does? Questions about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, the definition of genocide under international law, and they have the top scholars talk about all these. So is what's happening in Gaza a genocide? They have 3 international lawyers talk about this. Palestine and free speech, anything that you could think of that's become like the top discussion points on October 7th, they have the best Palestinian scholars speak about that in 1 hour webinars.
Was one provoking session. I really appreciated that. But I had a few observations to make. When it comes to the global liberation movements, most of the time people tend to quote Gandhi a lot and try to take the inspiration of non-violence and his legacy and his ideas. But if we understand the socio-political part of Gandhi, it's not that liberating and egalitarian in its own way. I mean, if we deeply study his letters which he wrote when he was in Johannesburg in South Africa, he wrote to the British Empire saying that we Indians are superior than the blacks. So there is an incident where he also was not devoid of that racist ideology. And second thing is,
Could I add to that real quick?
sorry.
Could I add to that real quick?
Yeah.
Another
point. And that's where we have to understand, we have to revisit our ideological factions to gather more information from our past. And that's where I want to quote where Dr. Ambedkar, who was again a towering contemporary in India vis-a-vis Gandhi, he said, Gandhi's heart melted for the apartheid in South Africa, but he don't want to realize the apartheid in every Indian village where the Dalits were lynched and killed every day and women were paraded naked. So we have to understand this thing as well.
Yeah, and it's a deliberate de-radicalization strategy by Western like education to like promote Gandhi or like other figures and other struggles that aren't as radical. We see this all the time in the Black liberation movement as well in the United States. They'll always talk about Martin Luther King. I mean, even Martin Luther King's like has more radical leanings that like they would never talk about, but they would never read Huey P. Newton in class. We're never going to read Asad Shakur in class, and there's a good reason for that. So thank you. Any question?
One, when we are for high school topics, we could have the
slides. Because we have a lot of, and we try to have a lot of conversations there. So we spend a lot of time explaining a lot of these things. So we have these slides that we really helpful. So we really love if you could share it in the way possible.
Could you leave like your email address on a piece of paper?
And the second thing is small updates which happen 45 minutes in the midst of this session is where the New York Times came out with an article saying Israel view Hamas's attack ran more than a year ago. It has just been published at 7:50. So I asked everyone to read through this. It's very confined. A lot of information regarding how the Israeli government knew what was happening and how it was going to happen about a year back. And that's it.
Thank you.
So our next session is music. Thank you so much.
Yeah, okay. Please get more food. Again, we have space till 8:30, so feel free to hang out.